Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to UW-Platteville Baraboo Sauk County. We are so excited to have all of you here this afternoon. My name is Sarah Rolchin. I'm an academic advisor and coach here on campus. I'm also the chair of the Diversity Committee, through which we are able to bring you this event today. I am introducing Dr. Frank King, who is an associate professor and program coordinator of ethnic studies at UW-Platteville. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in Social Studies, Education, and History from Eastern Washington University and his PhD from in American Studies from Washington State University. Thank you. His areas of specialization are interesting. They are hip hop pedagogy, the prison industrial complex, Afrocentric philosophy, and African American history. We are going to take questions at the end, but we ask that you just, I don't want to say sit back and enjoy maybe, but sit forward and be engaged in Dr. King's presentation today. So please help me in welcoming Dr. King. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is really cool. I've never seen this before, so I actually want to play with it, but I'll put it down for a second. So when I was offered the opportunity to visit your campus, I kind of was figuring out, like, what do I want to talk about? And so I thought about, like, the current political structure that's taking place across the country are programs, particularly courses that pertain to Black history, are being dismantled. So I wanted to kind of start off by giving some historical information, but not necessarily from the standpoint of a trivia, but then later on kind of look at how we can attack the processes of trying to sugarcoat or whitewash our historical narratives. So one of my favorite historians, his name is John Henry Clark, and he has probably my favorite quote, and unfortunately you can't see with the image right there, but he says that history is a clock. I got to look at it right here. That history is a clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is also a compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells a people where they've been and what they have been, where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells a people where they still must go and what they still must be. The relationship of history to a people is the same as the relationship between a mother and her child. He's probably one of my favorite historians. And I thought that this was possibly the thing that resonated and made me want to study history far more. And studying the understanding of how people are impacted by the narratives of the past. When our history is told in one narrative, we kind of become very accustomed to it, and we embrace that. Because oftentimes when the history is about a positive thing, then we see the good things that are impacting our lives. We think that we had some type of connection with that past. But then also there's a problem, because when people are disregarded or ignored from that historical narrative, they're told that they're not significant, they don't matter. So we're talking about Black History Month, and we have Carter G. Woodson, who is one of the founders of the idea of Black history. He started Negro History Week in 1926. And what most people do, here's the thing that a lot of folks do from a comedic standpoint. They say, well, they give Black History Month in February, the coldest month out of the year, the shortest month out of the year, because of insignificance, or just kind of like somehow they feel like the man gave us this little month. But there's a historical significance behind this, because Negro History Week was the time of the birthdays of both Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And the second week of February coincided with this. But then in 1976, it becomes Black History Month. Now, we could stop with that with Carter G. Woodson. We could just stop and say, well, he founded Black History Month. But here's the deal. Carter G. Woodson was an amazing person. He was a teacher and a principal even before his bachelor's degree. Any ed majors? All right, so you wouldn't be able to do this today, all right? But possibly that happened. And then he went to the Philippines and he became a school supervisor in the Philippines. And he became the second Black American to earn his PhD from Harvard University. The first one was W.E.B. Du Bois. That's another great thing about it. But also what Carter G. Woodson faced as a historian, as an expert in his field. He was barred from attending the American Historical Association and conferences. Even though he paid the dues for it, he was barred from it. So he fought back and started creating organizations and publications himself. And he said that Black history was ignored, overlooked, and suppressed. So what he did, he founded the Study for Negro Life and History. Now it's called the Study for African American Life and History. And also he studied the Negro History Journal, which is now the African American History Journal. And the mission is the scientific study of neglected aspects of Negro life and history. Now, at that time, the term Negro was an acceptable term, but now we don't use that term. It's more of it's an outdated term, but we're still using that in the context of his statement. So what this conversation is going to be is that Black history is being overlooked, ignored, neglected, and suppressed. So we're going to look at some examples of this and find out why this is happening. And I think by the end of this, I'm hoping that we could say this is an intentional thing that's been done over not just these last few years, and we'll talk more in detail about those last few years, but over decades and possibly centuries. So, how many of you have heard of Henry Box Brown before? All right, so Henry Box Brown's an amazing story. If you look at just a general story that's taking place, this is what you're going to hear. Henry Box Brown paid $86 to be shipped in a crate to escape slavery. So he was in the South, he used this box to escape to go to the North, wind up in Philadelphia. That's usually the story where it stops. But there's something amazing about this man, right? So the crate was turned upside down multiple times, even though it said this side up, right? How many of us have packages that have that before, right? We all have, right? So he had to stay quiet. He had to be in a 3-foot by 2-foot box and could not move. And there was only a few holes. I think it started off with 3 and he had like a little thing to drill to make more holes. The crate turned upside down and he was under for 18 miles. Now that's horse and buggy and by boat. So 18 miles by car may be a little bit different than horse and buggy and by boat, right? So he's upside down at that time. And he talked about, he felt like his eyes were going to pop out. He was in so much pain. But this is 27 hours total he was in this during this ride. Here's the deal about this. He said, oh, this is right. Yeah, I felt my eyes swelling as if they would burst from their sockets, and the veins on my temples were dreadfully distended with pressure of blood upon my head. Now, I can't even sit in the backseat of a car because my legs really get cramped up and I'm tired, right? So being in a box that size would be really, really difficult to be in. But here's the deal, there's another thing about him. He becomes famous from being this person that escaped through a box that was mailed. So much so that he makes a living telling his story. Not only that, He's a performer, he's a singer, he's a magician, and he's a hypnotist. Even some places, he used what he learned on the plantation regarding healing mechanisms or healing methods, and he wound up being considered a doctor, not necessarily having a degree, but at that time in the 1800s, doctors really were not very experienced with any type of medical. It was like anybody could be a doctor in some of those places, right? The medical field was atrocious at that time. So he said he was a doctor, and people believed that he was a doctor. And he performed until his death in 1897. So the story about him was that he was not just an enslaved person. He gained his freedom, and then he wound up becoming very successful and traveled throughout the part of the North, went to Canada. He died in Canada, lived most of his life in Canada, went to Europe and traveled, and he was a performer. And people would say he was a very, very brilliant person, very smart and crafty. So he took advantage of the opportunities he was able to have. But he wasn't the only one. There were other people that did this. There were other people that escaped human bondages. They did it through disguising themselves. They did it for passing to be white. So there were a lot of light-skinned enslaved people that would travel at night and people couldn't tell, especially if they're in the dark roads, that whether they were white or black. They would cover themselves and cover their faces to make sure that people didn't see by putting their hats over their faces. And then people would just kind of assume that they were white. And also shipping containers. It was a conscious effort for enslaved people to leave and flee the bondage that they were facing. It was a constant effort of enslaved people to fight for their freedom to the point of revolting. These are very important stories because it's a reflection of the American spirit, right? We like to say our nation was built out of rebellion and resistance to tyranny. This is a form of rebellion and resistance to tyranny, but somehow this is being suppressed in a lot of ways. So the question is, why is this story so important? We only hear that he escaped. Why did he escape? What was actually happening? So one thing was his wife and children were sold. And he just said, I can't be a part of this anymore. I can't do this anymore. So he wound up escaping, right? What is actually happening? He's escaping an oppressive situation. Why is it that it's so hard for folks to actually bring this up and discuss about it? And I'm talking about folks from the standpoint of school boards, state legislatures, and potential presidential nominees. What trauma did slavery cause? We never hear his life after escape, right? So this guy, Henry Box Brown, goes from enslaved to his actual title in one of his advertisements, Professor of Animal Magnetism. I don't know what that is, but it seems fascinating. And then this is Isabella Baumfree. Isabella Baumfree had a very unique life. She was one of the most influential abolitionists and the most vocal of human rights activists, right? So she traveled all around the North and the West advocating for slavery, or advocating against slavery, not for. And what was happening was there were a lot of white abolitionists that would bring enslaved people to tell their stories. And she was one of those people, but she was also like an activist. She was one of the most profound. So let's talk about her story. 1897, she was born in New York, and she ran away. But she likes to say in her autobiography, I did not run away, I walked away by daylight. And she says it with pride too. And she became a preacher, and she changed her name to Sojourner Truth. So this is the story of one of the most significant individuals that when we talk about American history and talk about the time of the chattel slavery, she is one of the most profound abolitionists. And she wrote a famous speech called the Ain't I a Woman speech. And this speech is controversial for a very interesting way. So in the Women's Convention, this took place in the Women's Convention in 1851, all right? And this was not the title of her speech. She didn't have a title for her speech. And the actual term, ain't I a woman, never appeared in the original speech. So what happens with this speech? This is really interesting about how the narrative changes and being co-opted and controlled by the dominant narrative. So this speech is talking about women's rights. And she says, one of the first lines is, I am a woman's rights. And the speech talks about how women should be treated equal as the same as men. We're still having that type of argument today, right? So talking about the harshness that she faced as an enslaved woman. And she says that enslaved women are impacted even more. So if we look at it the standpoint of the term intersectionality, we're seeing that there's layers. So we have dominant group, which would be men, and then we have the group as being labeled as subordinate, which is women. But then oftentimes we have layers of which women who are white oftentimes have opportunities and advantages that women of color do not have. So this is what happened. The original transcriber is Marius Robinson, and he knew Sojourner Truth, and they worked together on this transcription. She was happy for it. Now, she could not read or write herself, but she was brilliant. So she understood, this is what I said, this is what this person wrote. So he transcribed what she said for her. But this is what happened. 1863, Civil War started going on. And Frances Gage, a feminist who was in charge of the women's conference that Sojourner Truth presented in 1851, creates a new narrative. But the way she creates a narrative in saying Sojourner Truth said this was that she created the slave dialect in the speech to make it seem more authentic. Now, Sojourner Truth, her original language when she was born, she knew Dutch. Her owner was a Dutch business person that she learned Dutch until she was 9. That's all she spoke. So she didn't speak English until after 9 years old. So she didn't have a Southern slave accent that was become stereotypical that we're constantly accustomed to understanding, accustomed to being exposed to. So why did she have to do this? Why did Frances Gage create this whole thing? She could have just said, yeah, this is something Sojourner Truth said, but then she had to add this whole new language. One of the greatest things about this is that this is probably my favorite thing that she talks about in the speech. And the speech is relatively short. It's only like a couple paragraphs. But she says, but the women are coming up blessed by God, and few of the men are coming up with them. But man is in a tight place. The poor slave is on. Women is coming up on. And he is surely between a hawk and a buzzard. So saying that men, you have to watch out. You're not going to be at the top of the hierarchy anymore. You need to make some type of change to make sure we have an equitable society. She said that in 1851. That's pretty profound. So my question is, why did Frances Gage feel important to change the way Sojourner Truth spoke? Is it more appeasing to a sympathetic white audience? Possibly. Or is it saying that this is not Black enough? We need to make it Black by changing the dialect, from changing it to standardized or English to a more profound version of Black vernacular. So how do we explain to our youth these type of things? How do we have these types of conversations? Because I think it's very important that we do have these types of conversations with our students or young folks to ensure that we have a true, authentic version of historical narratives. One thing is, why did they want to escape? Why did they want to escape? What was so bad about chattel slavery that caused people to flee? When I teach a class about race in the criminal justice system, and people always ask, like, what does this have to do with uh, the police? And if you look at the South originally did not have a large police force. Laws start being put in place to police enslaved people who were going to do this. Out of this evolves the police force in the South. We have deputized people by the state and a whole industry that's created to enact policies or enforce policies to control the slave population in the South. This is how the Southern police establishment becomes a force across the entire state, Southern states. Beforehand, it was not. It was like you had a local sheriff that was there, but there was not necessarily people deputized. We start seeing this. In 1858, this is a police badge, plantation police for South Carolina. The term peculiar institution comes up. Instead of saying slavery, it's the peculiar institution. Our founding fathers or framers of the Constitution have snippets of slavery, but they never used the term slave. Why don't they use that? It's the shame of them. They knew that slavery was an important institution for them economically. They were making a lot of money off of this. But they also had a hidden shame that they hated the fact that they were owning human beings. And they had to rationalize and justify it, so much so that it's kind of like in the Constitution, it's there, but it's not blatant. But how do we explain this to our young folks? I don't know. So I'll give you an example. A couple years ago, the Wisconsin State Legislature wanted to not necessarily get rid of ethnic studies programs in our UW system. So the UW system has requirements where you have to take at least one ethnic studies type course, right? Where you learn about the experience of marginalized communities. And they said they wanted to have a constitution class to count as that. And I was like, fine, because I got a whole lot of stuff that we can show about the Constitution in this, right? Talking about the Constitution, we're encountering the 3/5 compromise, talking about how regarding indigenous peoples, talking about how people are counted, all these things. Slavery is in the Constitution, but you have to dig for it and look at it. But they don't want that. They want to have something else. And this is something that we'll talk about in a little bit. So for Black people, history is like a clock. That is so true. For all of us, history is a clock. But for people from marginalized communities, for Black and brown, from indigenous people, from Asian Americans, their stories are not told in the full force way. And so what happens is it becomes a clock with no hands. And the people oftentimes who look to that past oftentimes have no direction. Winds up sanitizing the historical narrative. This is a painting from the last couple of years by an artist named Jonathan Harris. I think he's from Detroit, and it's called Critical Race Theory. And this is something that I think is happening very prevalently across the country. And we'll talk a little bit about this because people who are activists understand the importance of understanding history. We like history. Hopefully we have good teachers that could teach us history. I was like, didn't really have any good teachers until afterwards. And then I started like, wow, I really like history. But my K through 12 experience, it was not a very good time when it came to start learning about historical narratives. So this is something that happened. This is Martin Luther King. And we can go into a whole discussion about how he has been depicted in our recent memory. The history books, which had almost completely ignored the contribution of the Negro in American history, only served to intensify the Negro's sense of worthlessness and to augment anachronistic doctrine of white supremacy. So what he's saying is that by ignoring this, we're just rationalizing and enforcing the dominant narrative of white supremacy. These are all the things that this group has created. This is the history of this group. And the other one, they don't have anything. So this is from Dr. King, Adam Clayton Powell, and CORE, which is the Congress for Racial Equality, pushed for textbooks to correctly portray the role and contribution of the American Negro and members of other ethnic groups. That's what their goal was, saying that these textbooks don't have anything, nothing when it comes to narratives about the experiences of these groups. So in 1966, John Hope Franklin, who is a phenomenal historian, or was a phenomenal historian, he wrote Land of the Free, which is the textbook that dismantles a lot of lies that were taking place, particularly the lost cause narrative. And if you don't know what the lost cause narrative is essentially saying that the South fought for the Civil War because the North was invading them, or they were fighting for liberty, they were fighting for rights, they were fighting because they had a certain way of life they wanted to maintain. You notice that I didn't say a certain thing out of this. That's exactly what the lost cause was. And so much so, it becomes an important part of our American historical narrative when it talks about the Civil War. Nikki Haley, who was, she did the exact same thing. Yep, she was she was presidential nominee, running for president, and she was saying that slavery was not a cause of the Civil War. Basically ignored that part, right? It's because she probably knows it. She definitely knows the truth. But the fact is, she knows that her constituents don't want to hear that. So this is in 1966. Once that book is written, there was an organization called the Land of the Free Committee. And there was also another organization called the John Birch Society, which is still around today, basically a conservative think tank, if you will. And so what they say is Land of the Free destroys America's past, develops a guilt complex, mocks American justice, indoctrinates towards communism, is hostile to religious concepts, overemphasizes Negro participation in American history, and promotes propaganda and poppycock. I don't know what poppycock means, but I guess it promotes that. That's when I first saw that image, education or indoctrination, in 1966. I was just flabbergasted. I was floored, because I'll show you something in a second. So what they were saying, and these are quotes from other individuals that were adamant against that being taught in schools. All the book did was talk about contributions of Black people. They said, no, we do not want that. Said, we do not believe that you can improve race relations by continued emphasis on injustices of the past. That's the exact opposite of what we need to be doing, right? School is no place to debunk our heroes. The book was one-sided for not showing people happy with their enslavement. And white kids should not be made to feel guilty. Take a note of this, because this is something that is still happening today. These exact words can be used in today's setting when it comes to the discussion of Black history. So we're going to talk about the 1619 Project. So if anybody does want these notes, I would be more than happy to supply them for you. So hopefully that'll be good for you. So the 1619 Project. So this was a series by the New York Times in 2019. And it had some problems. Don't get me wrong, it had some problems. There were some historical inaccuracies. So from a standpoint of facts, there could have been an actual legitimate conversation that could have been taking place. But that wasn't what it was. It was saying that it wants to frame America and saying that America is fundamentally racist, that America, this is teaching people not to love their country. This is teaching white kids to be guilty or feel guilty about this. So it was never about the content. It was just the overall theme of what the 1619 Project was perceived to represent. So conservatives wanted to cancel. So when we talk about cancel culture, this is one of the first things that we could think of in talking about this, because they wanted to ban this from being taught in schools. Once again, not for the content, but because it proposed a threat to the dominant narrative of how history is being betrayed in our society. So in 1776 report, this is created by former President Trump in 2020. And it was a direct rebuttal to the 1619 Project. That's all that was. Just saying the 1619 Project was wrong. And they wanted to promote whatever it is, meaning by patriotic education. I don't know what that is, but it doesn't sound very good. It heavily criticized, historians said this is junk, this is garbage. And so it just kind of wound up dismissed because it got published around January of 2021. And if you know what happened there, it was probably a bigger issue that was taking place. So this is a time when critical race theory becomes at the forefront. And this is so funny. I want y'all to play a game when you go home with your friends and family members and ask them what critical race theory is. Most of the time, people don't know what it is, right? It's like we just know that we're not supposed to like it. And that's what this is. So across the country, all these laws, anti-critical race theory laws, start being implemented either the state level. Some people wanted to push it in the federal level, but nobody knows what it is. Even asking the people who were creating these laws did not know what critical race theory was. So what is critical race theory? This is the easiest summarization of it. It's a focus on American law through prism of race. That's it. We're focusing on legal scholarship. This is a grad school type of idea, right? I didn't know critical race theory until I went to grad school. Law students study critical race theory depending on the university. This is not something that's in K through 12 or anything like that. But that's the idea. This is the fear. So what happens is we're going to create this all-encompassing bad word, make it as vague as possible. But critical race theory is associated with Black history. Or we also have indigenous critical theory or critical indigenous theory, critical women's theory, or critical feminist theory. There's all kinds of other theoretical things that are housed under critical theory umbrella. But what it is talking about Black history and doing it from a place that is not as sanitized as what people want to think or want to actually make reality. So eliminating critical race theory is essentially eliminating Black history. And that's what they want to do. So this is what's happening. Here's some misconceptions. It's racist towards whites. No, it's not. Because it's talking about laws, talking about policies, and saying, is this law, is this policy racist? Any discussion of history or critique of the institutions of our society is looked at as an attack on white people. So just by existing, these historical narratives existing, wind up looked at as an attack on white individuals or the overall white populace for some reason. And it's not. So once again, education, not indoctrination. Same thing that they were saying in 1966. It's indoctrinating our kids. Kids aren't studying critical race theory. And so therefore, we need to teach this patriotic thing. So which becomes more indoctrinating, this idea of patriotism, of love of the country, of everything, or something else. And I'm not sure they're trying to say you should love your country because of this, this, and this. They're saying you can't criticize anything that this country has done. And he also promotes Marxism, which is another term that most people don't know. Go and ask your friends and family what Marxism is. Most people don't know what that is either. So this is what I'm saying. A lot of people want to go back to this. This is an actual textbook from, gosh, I think 1957 in Virginia. And I know you can't see it, but I'm going to read it. So this is an actual enslaved individuals coming off their slave ship to meet their new masters. Early in Virginia's history, the General Assembly made laws closely controlling the Negroes. However, the laws were not fully enforced. Many slave masters did not like to have the state government meddle in what they considered private business. They managed their servants according to their own methods. They knew the best way to control their slaves was to win their confidence and affection. Many Negroes were taught to read and write. We have laws in place that said the exact opposite. Many of them were allowed to meet in groups for preaching. There were laws against doing that. Or funerals and singing and dancing. They went to visit at night and sometimes owned guns and other weapons. So this is the exact opposite of what they're doing. What actually took place in reality, they just kind of just created and flipped the script to a bizarro world type thing. This is what people want to go back to. And the reason why I'm saying this is because if we look at this, Florida rejects some social studies textbooks and pushes publishers to change others. They want to get rid of any type of narrative. So what do they want to get rid of? This is what they want to implement. This was from Texas. And this is a Texas textbook. And so it's talking about the Atlantic slave trade between 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the United States to work on agricultural plantations. Now, how many of y'all have jobs? Y'all are workers, right? Now, how many of y'all have quit your job or you went to a different job or something else or got paid for your job, right? But somehow this is looked at as these millions of people who were enslaved are somehow being characterized as workers. This is something that's interesting. This is also from a Florida textbook most recently, right? So Fred Korematsu grew up in California. He wanted to be treated with respect. Some people treated him differently. He worked hard for everyone to be treated with respect. Now, who is Fred Korematsu? He's a civil rights activist that fought during the internments of Japanese Americans. He refused to not be in those. The Supreme Court ruled against him and forced him into these internment camps. Why? Because he was Japanese American. He was an American citizen that looked the same as the people who attacked us during Pearl Harbor. So therefore, he had to be affiliated with those individuals or that country. So therefore, we take away that whole thing and sugarcoat it and say that he wasn't treated nice. Why not? Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks showed courage. One day she rode the bus. She was told to move to a different seat. She did not. She did what she believed was right. Takes away a lot of that story, right? Talking about how this was an intentional effort by the civil rights movement There were other people that did the exact same form of resistance. Rosa Parks was intentionally pointed out. One, because she was light-skinned. Two, she looked mild-mannered, so she wasn't going to resist forcefully or anything like that. So they purposely made her as that individual. It was a strategic mechanism. It was a strategy to ensure that this was going to be a successful movement, and it sparked the civil rights movement. Florida, new standard, a blow to our students' nation. Florida's new history standard says African Americans benefited from slavery. Florida educators using social studies teacher are furious about it. So what's happening is they're saying in some textbooks in middle schools and maybe high schools, I think too, is that slavery benefited enslaved people. So that means they learned a craft, they learned a trade. So obviously they were able to leave and then go and start their own businesses and pull themselves up out of bootstraps and establish industries themselves. Because we've heard all those stories that took place, right? This is what's happening in Florida. Florida is the guinea pig, I guess, of what other states are wanting to do, including the state of Wisconsin. So critical race theory becomes the boogeyman, but now we have a new term because over the past couple of years, it just didn't work out as well. Now we have woke. I'm afraid of woke. What does that mean? What does woke mean? Once again, you ask people what this is. So much so, there was somebody who wrote a book about wokeness. And then during an interview, she was asked to define woke. Guess what she could not do? So let me give you a real quick history about woke, and then we'll come to the Q&A section. So woke it's been around since the 1930s, and actually it was a jazz song by a guy named Lead Belly, and he wrote a song called "Stay Woke," and the song was a resistance song to the Scottsboro Boys. The Scottsboro Boys were 5 young Black men who were accused of raping 2 white women on a train in the 1930s. And they served a long period of time in prison. They did not do it, but their lives were essentially ruined because of this. So woke means to be socially conscious. This is the definition of this, right? This has been something that has been discussed in Black communities for a long time. Stay woke. Woke means to be socially conscious, aware of injustices impacting Black communities. To basically stay awake to all these injustices. Be aware to these injustices. So here's what he talks about. If I had $1 for every time he says woke. So this is Ron DeSantis, who's running for president, or he was running for president, but he's the governor of Florida. Says, we fight the woke in the legislature. We fight the woke in the schools. We fight the woke in corporations. We will never, ever surrender to the woke mob. Florida is where woke goes to die. I'm sure he probably knows what it is. Probably not. All right. So it becomes a rallying call for conservative ideology. We're fighting woke. I don't know what it is, but I know I'm supposed to hate it. That's their narrative. And it's an all-encompassing term for anything that despises. It is regarding issues pertaining to communities of color, but also LGBTQ plus issues, specifically transgender rights. This is the woke ideology. Denying people their existence. That's what their idea is. Wokeness means being aware of their issues, denying this. So much so, this individual up here with the Bud Light can, she just had her picture on a beer, on one beer, and next thing you know, people become irate and saying that Bud Light is somehow promoting trans identity. She just had one picture on the beer. They did that to a lot of other people that were social media influencers. It's an attack on anybody who is labeled as the other. Now, I'm not gonna use the term, but there is a term in this quote that is probably the most controversial word in the English language, the N-word, right? We know what it is. And there's all types of different interpretations of how it's used and all that kind of stuff. That's a whole different conversation. But I want you to understand what I'm trying to say, and hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. So this is Lee Atwater. Lee Atwater was a brilliant strategist during Ronald Reagan and even prior to Ronald Reagan, right? He was very important to the conservative movement. And he talks about what's called the Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy is basically when the Southern states flip from voting Democrat to Republican, right? Because of various political views and everything like that. They felt that Northern Democrats were becoming too woke, if you will. And so they wanted to be the opposite of that. So beforehand, they were a Democratic majority in the South. 1970s or 1960s, with LBJ's election, winds up becoming, what's it called? It starts flipping. So sorry about that. It starts flipping. So what he says is, you start out in 1954 by saying the N-word. That by 1968, you can't say that. That hurts you. You say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of it is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. So any way you look at it, race is coming on the back burner. He understood this. He understood. You can't say it, but you have to use what's called dog whistle politics, meaning that people know what they're saying, but you're not necessarily saying anything blatant. You can't use the blatant derogatory terms, but you kind of use certain things that people understand. And what I'm trying to say is that this is the new N-word. CRT and woke become this. We're going to stop the woke. We're going to ban CRT. We're going to stop the woke. We're going to ban CRT. And that's what they're talking about. Eradicating woke means talking about the experiences that Black folks and also LGBTQ plus people are facing. The right to exist, the right for their stories to be told. Now we have to ban these books, ban their ideas, ban all this stuff because we don't want indoctrination of our children. That's the narrative that's taking place. That's the idea that's taking place. So we're trying to eradicate woke. I am going to skip him. This is a guy that is the leader behind all this stuff. Terrible person. All right, this is a jerk. All right, so let's talk about echo chambers and misinformation. These are the peddlers of this. I'm picking on Fox News, but other entities are doing the exact same thing. It's not just Fox News, right? So Rush Limbaugh, he was a part of this. Sean Hannity, Tucker Carlson, every single night for people who are watching that news source are picking up all this stuff, and they're picking up massive misinformation and essentially taught to hate. But not just Fox News, we have massive social media campaigns. We have a lot of people on the internet. So it's all this stuff is just being bombarded with people of misinformation. So what is happening, right? So all these tropes, immigration and invasion, we hear this today. This is the same thing that's been said for over 250 years, longer than that. Black Lives Matter, the war on cops, war on Christmas, transphobia, socialism. Once again, people don't know what socialism is, voter fraud, attack on American values, real Americans, all these things are being done, and Fox News is making billions of dollars off of these feeders. And it's not just Fox News. Once again, Fox News is just the easiest thing. There's so many more that do far worse. Real quick, this is really cool. So we talk about how much CRT is mentioned. CRT is mentioned in not just Fox News, but just in so many ways. You could see the uptick of the total amounts of times. In just 3.5 months, from June 2020 to June 2021, it just goes up massively. And in 3 months, 3.5 months, 1,900 times it's mentioned. Assume every CRT mention is 1 to 2 minutes. That's a lot of minutes that's dedicating to it. Now, Let's assume this is the continuation. The greatest threat to us in existence, in our existence as a species, or in our existence as a time of life existing on this planet, is climate change. How much time has been spent? 380 minutes in 2020 on climate change. How many times have been discovered that everything else? 107,000 minutes. So that means CRT has been mentioned far more in our political atmosphere over the last 5 years, a total of 800 minutes. Climate change in 5 years has been mentioned, a total of 800 minutes. We talked about CRT being mentioned in just 3 months, massively. And we wonder why people don't believe climate change exists. So what I'm saying is Black history is American history. How can we heal as a society if we sweep everything under the rug? How are we going to heal if we don't address the past injustices? We can talk about these things without addressing and saying that individuals themselves are by inherently racist. We can do that. We can talk about the systemic problems that's taking place. We could talk about the structural problems. We could talk about how this country did create benefits for people based off of racial identity and take away people's rights based off of racial identity. We should be able to do that so we know not to make this change. Or know to make this change, apologies. So out of that, I really appreciate you having me. Just know that know as much as possible and learn as much as possible, but also be advocates for justice and being able to share the information and an accurate portrayal and do it in a loving way, not to be attacking people, because human beings do become, start blocking themselves and don't want to be told that they're wrong. But we got to be able to say, like, hey, I love you, but you are not right. All right. Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you.
Does anybody have a question they wanted to ask of Dr. King? Are you going to talk about the prison justice?
Oh my goodness, we could talk about that. Listen, yeah, it's a profound thing. The criminal justice system itself is just profound, but the prison industrial complex, of which basically we have created an entire industry using prisons, prison labor, capitalizing on prisons, actually counting people in certain districts so they have more representatives from voting. It's just, there's so many things that we can talk about. We could talk about the total failure of the war on drugs. We could talk about the total failure of how our prison system doesn't really stop crime and how we punish people oftentimes that may be even innocent, just because we have like so many things regarding plea bargains, and it's like, don't go to trial because you'll get more time, even if you're innocent. And people that are like even awaiting trial, have not even been in trial, are waiting years in prison, just awaiting trial. So there's so many things. One thing is that oftentimes when you say like things are made in the USA, there's a high probability it's made with prison labor. So yeah, it's very, very interesting about that.
But with the cost of it to taxpayers, and why are we supporting it when we know it doesn't make us safer? We know so many things.
Right.
The price they charge for them to make a phone call or send an email compared to what they get paid. A copay on their health care. It just doesn't make any sense. And just us compared to Minnesota.
Right.
We incarcerate twice as many people per capita as Minnesota.
Yeah.
And our crime rates are very similar. Why does the taxpayer at least? I mean, I know they're inmates and nobody cares because they're inmates and most of them are Black. So we can just ignore it. And it's a political, storm too. Well, we're tough on crime. And if you do anything to do anything to fix the prison system, you're just not up to cut.
Truthfully,
That's hard.
you could teach the class. I mean, because really, you were 100% right. Like, why? And it's true. I have no idea why we're doing it. I just know that there are so many corporations and politicians that are benefiting from these financially, from getting people to understand, like, or getting people to feel that there's fear going on. I'm afraid that we need to amp up crime or amp up punishment for crime and incarceration because I want to feel safer. All these things are going on. So people are benefiting massively, and us as taxpayers, we don't know where our money goes, right? And so if we had a line item, and like some countries, they have line items of where like every percentage of their tax paying money goes to, we would see that, you know, along with the prison industrial complex, we have the military industrial complex where the vast majority of our money goes to, right? So that's a very very important thing. It's like I have no answer because it's just so much money involved.
Other people,
Mhm.
reincarcerate them for nonviolent, low violence.
Yes.
We could empty 2 prisons just by changing that.
Yeah.
And now they're talking, seeing what's going on in Waupun or Green Bay.
No, I haven't seen
People
it.
have been on lockdown for a year because they have no guards. Because Governor Walker with Act 10, it didn't just affect the teachers, it affects the guards, and
Yeah.
people quit. And every time you quit and you make people work harder and force overtime, more people quit.
Yeah.
Now we are in a complete crisis that people should be screaming about. Men have been locked in cells for a year with mental health issues. Most of them aren't getting their medications because there's nobody there to give it.
Give it to them. Yeah.
And now we have $100,000 wages for guards to try to get people hired. And now people that were social workers and nurses, they're quitting their jobs to be guards because they're making so much.
Yeah.
They're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul.
100%.
It's a critical
Yeah.
situation, and it's just inhumane.
Yeah.
We are better than this.
And it's in whether it violates the Constitution, like the Constitution, 8th Amendment says no cruel and unusual punishment.
Writing articles about the prison system in Wisconsin right now. That's how bad it is to the country, and we seem to be
Yeah.
completely oblivious.
That's what it is. We don't see it. We just know that they're arrested and they obviously did bad things, so we don't want anything to do with them and let's them disappear. No.
Very bad.
Right.
They're allowed.
Right. I mean, you think about like how the harsh treatment, that probably the food has been like atrocious and oftentimes violating major health standards. They're not considered human beings in a way. And you're exactly right. They're just cast them aside, and whatever punishment that they're receiving, oftentimes it leads to they deserve that. Yeah, it's terrible. And once again, how this structure goes, people are making money off of this in some form or fashion. So those companies that own those prisons or even the state, they're receiving tax-paying money, they're receiving money in donation, not no donation, but large amounts of money. They don't really care. As long as they keep getting paid, that's all that matters to them. They're making a profit. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm with you I'm with you 100%. It's atrocious.
Anyone else, any other comments? Yeah. I'm gonna have you use the mic so everybody.
I know it is, but not everybody likes.
I've had a stroke,
Yeah,
so forgive me. How does religion fall into CRT?
Oh, could you say that again, please?
How has religion basically in this country promoted CRT?
I don't think it has. From the standpoint of, are you talking about like religious leaders kind of promoting critical race theory from this standpoint, or? I'm having
You took a people and you made them believe what you believe.
oh, okay, yes, yes. So I always talk about like the American hegemon, where it's kind of like we are consenting to our domination by the dominant narrative, right? So yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of connections with how historical narratives have an influence us in the same way as whatever our religious viewpoints are influence us from that standpoint. but there's oftentimes could be some conflict that's taking place. So I would say there is, this is not an attack on anybody's view, religion, or anything like that, but the evangelical is a belief has a stranglehold on conservative ideology, right? I think for the most part, we can agree with that. Like conservative political leaders have to cater to evangelicals in some form or fashion. And I think out of that, I think that those evangelicals want to go back to this Puritan idea, this idea of history being more patriotic, loving the country, being more of, they want to bring in, like, even the places that want to ban books, they want to include the Bible more, they want to include prayer in schools more. So I think that may be the connection that you may be talking about. Like, it's just kind of like, well, probably, but it's like, that's what I'm thinking of from that standpoint of like looking at religious leaders wanting to have this idea and saying, we don't need to talk about this. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I have to look at it. Yes. So
Culture, we could address this from the perspective of what I believe the bottom line is fear. There seems to be just so much fear of other and
Mhm.
fear of change and fear of the composition of our country not looking like it maybe did in 1950s black and white television.
Yeah.
And yet somehow there's this desire to want to go back to something that supposedly felt familiar and safer.
Right.
But it feels like it's grounded in fear. I mean, even, the Florida comment, about how the slaves came here as workers to work in agricultural plantations. Well, how is that any different than immigrants crossing the southern border and working on some of the farms here? Why was it okay then and now it's not okay? It feels like there's so much fear.
Yeah. It's easy for us to vilify the other, right? So it's always got to be something else. And what happens is this narrative is that there's no solution, right? Politicians, they have no solution to what our actual problems are, right? We can see astronomical wealth going into the hands of fewer and fewer people, while students, your generation, is facing harsher and harsher times, student loan debt, uncertainty regarding jobs, right? So we have that, but there's no solution. So basically, what I feel is that this becomes a distraction. It becomes an easy distraction. And always been the case, like the scapegoat. Like I see you, and the immigrants are causing our problems. They're the reason why I don't have a job, right? So it's easier for me to point the finger at the people that have no power at all, as opposed to those corporations that are going on, right? So I remember people talking about when jobs started being outsourced in the 1990s. Oh, my job's going to China. The Chinese are taking our jobs away. Who has those jobs, right? Who owns those businesses? It is U.S. corporations oftentimes that here and they found a cheaper labor source and they left. It was not the people that are basically making $1 or $2 an hour or $2 a day that are the ones that are facing, all kinds of harsh conditions to make sure we have our cheap products. It's those businesses that are profiting of it, and they wind up changing the businesses, and politicians wind up creating this narrative that it's somebody else, right? The crisis at the border that we hear about, people are starting to realize it's not a crisis at all. It's not like it's propagated, but what we're hearing is it's an invasion. They're coming across the borders and they're coming to attack us. The same thing was doing when it came to the 19th century with Chinese immigrants. The same thing was being done with Polish immigrants, Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants. Those same narratives were taking place. So we have a history of hating the people who are looked at as outsiders, for one thing. That's just the primary of xenophobia. But also, like what you're talking about is like, the fear causes me to vote for this person who has no solution for me, but he hates them just as much as I do. So therefore, I'm going to support this person. There's no solutions that a lot of these politicians have, Democrats or Republican. But I think that their easiest thing is to instill fear for me to the point where I have to vote for this guy because he's going to be the one that's going to save me from them. And that's just, it's the easiest thing in the book for them to do, right? And what you're talking about also with the demographics changing, right? So we will, within what, 2050, I think, it's going to be, we're not going to have a white majority. We're going to have the white folks will still be the largest group, but they won't have the majority of numbers, right? So we break it down between white, Latino, and Black. White will still be the top, but if you ask white and non-white, then you're going to have a larger group that's going to be defined as non-white in our society for the first time since the arrival of the Europeans.
Are there sources that do currently provide, as an example, the authentic, holistic approach to history as a whole? I know there are some indigenous histories of the North America that has been presented, and the 1619 project is presenting, but is there one that's more as an example of what that would look like and it as
Like
a gauge to work towards?
Overarching type thing to address
Right.
all these. I know if we look online, I would say like start with the banned books that are being placed, and read the banned books, because most of the people who want to ban the books, they've never read them. So I think that's probably one. One that I always recommend, and it's been around for decades, is Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. That was the first thing that really opened my eyes up. I mean, I was just like, just mesmerized by it. And then just kind of Lies My Teacher Told Me by Lowen. Those were the kind of things, those are two books that just really introduced me to this radical thought of oh, history is not what people think it is. It's totally something else. And there's another book that I'm reading right now. It's called Myth America. It's by Kevin M. Cruz. It's really great. He's a historian. He really breaks down the Southern strategy idea very, very well. Myth America. It just came out last year, the year before. And then there's a new book that Colin Kaepernick, Robin Kelly. Robin Kelly is really one of the smartest people in the world. And someone else, I can't remember who that person is. It's called Our History Has Always Been Contraband. And it's basically a bunch of articles from historians from the past. This guy, Carter G. Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, a bunch of others, and is talking about their articles that is oftentimes would be banned in a lot of our history books. And if you ever want, please, my email is kingf@uwplatt.edu. I'd probably do better to give you a list of books through that way than just kind of off the top of my head. But please, yeah, feel free to contact me. I would love to share as much information as possible.
Thank you.
Do you want to catch it?
So I had a question about how we can get access to the presentation. You mentioned it earlier that you're willing to share it. How
Yes.
can we get it?
So John and I could give a copy to Sarah as well, and I can give those copies to you, and then you can get those. And also you can email me and I'll get you a copy too. Gotta die for it.
So I was just curious, you talked, and I'm so terrible with names, the gentleman who shipped himself in the box.
Oh, Henry Box Brown, yeah.
Henry Box Brown. How do you find, so he gets attention because he was a success, at least in getting out of slavery.
Yeah.
Where do you find the stories of the hundreds or thousands of people who tried something similar and didn't survive that ordeal, or were shot, or are trying to escape? Who tells those stories when they don't rise to prominence and don't become famous?
That is so true. And truthfully, there's so many stories that have never been told. I would say that the great thing is that once emancipation took place, there were a lot of northern white folks that would basically record the stories and write down the stories of slaves. So we have slave narratives of enslaved people, their stories. I think that does a lot of justice about their treatment, what they went through, possibilities of fleeing enslavement. But it's once again, like some of those stories just were never told. So we don't know the entirety of the folks that were successful and those who were not. But the slave narratives, looking at those, and some of those are actually transcribed on to audio now. So you would be able to hear their stories on audio. I don't know if it's their actual voices. I don't know, like 'cause later on down the line, there were probably some that were recorded, but I don't know if like right afterwards. I don't know when, was it 1920s or 1900s when we started recording people? I can't remember that. Sorry. Really appreciate you staying. I really appreciate you coming. Thank you. And once again, if you ever need anything or anything I can do to help, please feel free to reach out.